Hey, how you doing? Starting out, heading from work. I work overnights. Hey, sorry if I yawn, but it is the end of my shift and it's time to go home and go to bed. A lot of people can't sleep during the daytime, but if I didn't sleep during the daytime, I wouldn't survive very long. There's the University of Missouri at Kansas City. And Russell Stover Candies. It's not a candy store, it's an office building for Russell Stover. I have an interesting mid-century modern design, I think. We're heading west into Kansas. The American Civil War, starting in the 1850s when Kansas was just a territory. This was actually where the Civil War began, because the government decided, the Congress decided that states would be admitted to the Union based on what the voters would decide whether they come into the Union free or slave. Before that, they had made anything south of the Mason-Dixon line was a slave state, and anything north of that was a free state. And with the exception of Missouri, it was called the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was north of that line, and it came in as a slave state. And then, as the country was expanding west, there was more and more pressure to bring the states west of the Mississippi River in as slave or free. And, of course, they couldn't really make up their mind, so they decided, we'll just leave it up to, when people come into the territories, we'll leave it up to them whether they'll vote themselves in as free or slave. Well, that set up a huge conflict, because the next territory that was in line for that was Kansas territory to be settled. And a bunch of people came over the border from Missouri into Kansas to bring Kansas into the Union as a slave state. And another group of people came in from, of all places, Massachusetts, prohibitionists. And they were determined to bring Kansas in as a slave state, or as a free state. And among these people was a man and his sons by the name of John Brown. And he was a radical abolitionist. He was what you might call a of his day, or a how would you say, what do we call him now? He was radicalized, and he believed, which I don't know, I almost find sympathy with this point of view. He believed that he had a very apocalyptic view of the situation, that keeping people from being enslaved was worth anything he could do, up to and including murder, and because he was already ready to fight the war before it even anybody else was thinking there was a war. I mean, there were plenty of people who were ready to bust heads and commit murder to get their point of view across. So when John Brown came across and the pro-slavery people came across, they would find each other, and there was such a thing as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, and Lawrence, Kansas was a free state fortress. It's where everybody from Massachusetts settled. As a matter of fact, the main street in town is called Massachusetts Street. And the pro-slave forces came in and burned it to the ground. They didn't like the Lawrence, Kansas radical abolitionists, quote unquote. So when the whole country started seeing and reading about what was going on in Kansas, it was a hint. Things are getting tough. Things are getting bad. There's a lot of people ready to commit violence. A civil war is coming over the issue of slavery. And it all started in Kansas, which we are about to cross over the state line now. Kansas City, Missouri straddles the state line. And, the main Kansas City is here on the Missouri side. But then when you cross over the state line here, all these little towns, like, what town are we hitting first? I think we're hitting the town of Fairway, Westwood, one of the richest towns in the area, Mission Hills, with a lot of mansions. Here's state line right here. On the aptly named State Line Road. We are now, in Kansas. Welcome to Kansas. Free State Fortress. There's our Welcome to Kansas sign. When the Civil War began, Kansas gained statehood, in 1862, I believe, which was like the first real year of the war. And it came in as a free state. There was a state legislature that was started, the pro-slave state legislature. It was started in the town of Lecompton, and they were going to make Lecompton the state capital. But it wasn't considered legitimate, and there was a lot of accusations of, doesn't history repeat itself? Accusations of voter fraud. And however, in that period, there actually was voter fraud, because people who were coming over to Kansas from Missouri to vote were not residents of Kansas. They lived in Missouri, and they just crossed over just so they could vote, and then they went back to Missouri so they could vote Kansas in the Union as a slave state. And I believe that's where you got the pro-slave capital of Lecompton, Kansas. And there's the buildings and everything are still there. The original Capitol building where they held the vote. And the quote-unquote pro-slave legislature met. And then during the Civil War, the pro-slave forces from Missouri were called the Bushwhackers, because there weren't huge armies, very much the frontier, kind of the out of the middle of nowhere kind of thing, the edge of the country. And so there weren't big armies roaming everywhere. It was irregular forces. So on the Missouri side, they called them the Bushwhackers. They would jump out of the bushes and whack you, basically. Kansas side, there was more of a Union presence. Forces that were kind of, and they took over and held vast parts of Missouri. And you had Fort Leavenworth, which is still there. And then there was straight south, what's the name of that fort? There are several forts along the road. It was the old military road. It went straight, follows it now. And because military convoys would go up and down it, and patrols. It was sort of an early warning when rebel forces would come out of Missouri into Kansas and do some raids. And the Missouri Irregular Militia, the Kansas Irregular Militia. Everybody's heard this name before. They called themselves the Jayhawks or the Jayhawkers, and that's the name of the University of Kansas teams. The Kansas Jayhawks. And the Jayhawks were supposed to be it was an imaginary bird. A blue jay is a really loud, obnoxious bird, and of course a hawk is a very fierce bird. So they combined the two birds into one and called it the Jayhawks. And they usually wore the Union blue uniform, though they were irregular for the most part. They were kind of inducted into the Union Army, their distinction was they were called the Red Legs. They wore kind of a red, I don't know how you would say it, red leggings over their pants. And they all were also had a distinction for being very underhanded. Neither side, the Bushwhackers nor the Jayhawks, were very nice to each other, anybody they thought was their enemy. But the Jayhawks had a reputation of doing things, committing war crimes on the border, committing atrocities. So that's what made this whole situation on the border between Missouri and Kansas especially fierce. Some people will say that the worst part of the war was actually fought here, that Missouri was probably one of the most fought over states in the whole Civil War. But again, you don't see a lot of gigantic battles. It was like a lot of little skirmishes, a lot of fighting. And as the war progressed and the pro-Confederate forces got less and less, and their opportunities for winning the war and the whole Confederacy was going down the tubes, Confederate soldiers started turning to, or the Confederate guerrillas started turning more to raiding just for the plunder, because that's all they had been doing. That's all they knew. They had no prospects of employment. They had no money. And they were very angry and bitter. The Union soldiers and the Jayhawks had taken everything from them, in many cases including family members. And so, when we talk about the old Wild West and all the gunfights and the violence of the Wild West, that actually kind of originated out of the Civil War. And many could argue that a lot of people were suffering from PTSD from the things they had been through, the things they had done, and so naturally led to violence on the frontier. And a lot of those people were former Confederate soldiers. or Confederate guerrillas out of Missouri. And one of the more famous ones was Jesse James, the younger gang. They operated around here in Missouri, and they weren't known to be very nice people, actually. And some people will say, well, they're like Robin Hood and everything, except that, towards the end, the Confederate guerrillas became known as a real nuisance. Even the actual armies of the Confederacy, the soldiers and the generals and the governors and the police authorities, even they didn't like them. They were like, these people are only out for themselves. They don't represent any cause other than robbing people and stealing. It's not an honorable way of living. And one of the funnier stories, I think, is about when the James gang decided to go up and rob a bank in Minnesota. And of course, back then, when you robbed a bank, you weren't robbing. You rob a bank now, you're robbing an institution. It's insured. People might justify it that way. There's no real justification for it. You serve heavy prison time when you get caught. Not if you get caught, but usually when you get caught. But back in those days when you robbed a bank, it was like you were actually robbing the people of that town, because the way banks operated, it was pretty much run by the people in the town, and it was their money, and when you stole from the bank, you stole from them. So there was this town in Minnesota they decided to go up and rob. And the people in this town, all the farmers, caught wind of it and caught them in the bank. And there was a big shootout. I think there was a member or two of the gang that was killed. Unfortunately, there were people in this town that were killed too. And Jesse James and I believe his brother ended up having to walk all the way back to Missouri without their horses. And what made it even worse for them was they couldn't use any main roads because people were hunting for them. So they had to use backfields and things like that. And for some reason, I just think that's funny that they thought they could pick on some northern farmers, damn Yankees, and got themselves nearly killed and in a bad, embarrassing situation. I believe that the governor of Missouri at the time when they were about the time when Jesse James was killed by Bob Ford in St. Joseph, which is a city north of Kansas City. The governor was Crittenden, and I believe he was a Confederate at one time, very pro-Confederate governor or whatever. But by the time the Civil War was over, it was a lost cause. Confederacy was defeated. Time to get on with their lives and move ahead. And he actually put out a bounty on Jesse James. Tell you that a lot of the authorities, many of them who were Confederates at one time, did not care for the actions of the pro-Confederate guerrillas in Missouri. They had a bad name. They went across in 1860. What was it? 1860. In the middle of the Civil War, they went across. There was a jail here in Kansas City, and the Union rounded up relatives of some well-known Missouri guerrillas, like William Anderson, who became known as Bloody Bill Anderson. This rickety old dilapidated building which was on the south part of downtown Kansas City. And it was a makeshift jail, and some people would say that they even went in and weakened the building so it would collapse on purpose. Although I don't know if there's any proof of that. But, you know, the building collapsed. It killed some women who were members of the families of the guerrilla forces of Missouri, which enraged them. And they decided to take out revenge on the city of Lawrence, Kansas. And they were under the command of William Quantrill, who originally was from Ohio. And he kind of, before the Civil War, was kind of a unsuccessful at life kind of school teacher at one time, which was ironic because where he taught was Lawrence, Kansas. And he was from the North, but he took up the cause of the South. And I guess he didn't like school teaching, so he took up horse thieving and robbing and all sorts of stuff like that before the war. And then, of course, the war just sort of like radicalized him, and he was a avid pro-Southern Confederate, but he was never really he called himself captain, but he was never really ever commissioned in the military. He was not really a Confederate Army, never really considered him a part of the military. He was just a freelancer, so to speak. And then he took leadership over all these other freelancers, these Missouri guerrillas, and they were out for revenge and went across the border one night into Kansas and burned down the city and killed 150 men who were 150 men and boys who were many of them were just merchants and farmers and things like that, but anybody who could have been of military age. And the idea was to kill off anybody that was like could fight against the Confederacy. After that happened, things got really bleak on the border. The Union put out an order, which was very controversial and was actually rescinded a year later, that there would be these reservations for people loyal to the Union. You had to prove yourself to be loyal to the Union, and then you were allowed to move into these areas. And everything else outside of these areas for the 3 westernmost counties in Missouri was burned to the ground. It became known as the Burnt District. And the symbol of it was the stone chimneys that would be left of all these old farms. And of course, Union soldiers immediately came out, stole or slaughtered all the people's livestock, burned their fields, burned their houses down, of course. And if anybody just looked at them sideways, they just shot them right there on the spot. And things were already bleak in Missouri and Kansas because, there were a lot of people with mixed with different loyalties. Especially on the Missouri side, there were a lot of people here who did not support the Confederacy, were pro-Union, and so they might get a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and somebody would say, would be dressed in regular clothes, holding a gun, saying, "Which side are you on, Union or Confederate?" And if you guessed and said the wrong side, they shot you right there immediately, or they hauled you out of your house and shot you. Then they burned your house down. Both sides did that. Quite often they would go up to somebody's house and they already knew who they were, and they were there to kill them because they were supporting the wrong side. There's a movie that was made in 1999 by the director Ang Lee, It's called Ride with the Devil. And it's sort of a fictionalized account of the situation during the Civil War in Missouri. But, oh, by the way, we are in Kansas. Now we're crossing back over to Missouri. That's the Kansas River beneath us, or the Kaw, named after the Kaw Indians. There's our welcome to Missouri sign. But there was this movie made, and it's a really good movie. It's really well done. Does a good job of showing what life was like at the time and how rough it was and how violent it was in Missouri. So yeah, we can take a lot of lessons from that time. I believe that the people now who are talking openly about Civil War and sedition and stuff like that are a vast minority of people. I mean, there's a lot of people who are just kind of frustrated about politics, but that happens every 4 years, you know. One side loses, another side wins. But I think that the really radical fringe part of it, say that the people that really invaded the Capitol building, of them, maybe there was about 5,000. And I don't know how many people were actually at the protest. I mean, there have been other rallies in Washington that have been far more numerous. And I think that's part of it. Part of it is just that people know their point of view is not the mainstream, that they're in the minority, and they're going to be as loud and radical as they can be. And, you know, that in itself is kind of a mark of a terrorist. When you have a small minority of people who decide that this is the way things are going to be for everyone, and we don't care what you think, and if you don't think the way we think, then we're going to get violent. We've been here before in this situation. We survived it then, traumatized, but we got through it. I think things will die down for a while. I could be wrong. I mean, we'll see tomorrow. Because tomorrow will probably be a day that somebody might try something. Although now the apparatus of the state, the military, and they're pretty much ready for something. You know, all the police are out looking. The military's ready. Actually, what they've been talking about, what they're starting to worry about more, is an insider job, where somebody who's actually in the government, who should be vetted, or maybe in the military, will do something. But, you know, like supposedly on Sunday through tomorrow, all the state capitals were going to have armed protesters out front. And then in Washington, there were going to be armed protesters, although they've pretty much locked Washington down. Occupation now. And I don't say what we've always said, that the changeover of leadership of this country, well, it hasn't been this time around. Now it's kind of like, great, we've sort of lost our bragging rights on that. How our system of government is so good that the old president gets out of office, he can just step down and even have a welcoming committee for the new incoming administration. Not anymore. I mean, thank you. Thanks for doing that. That's not good for our country. And I've talked with some Trump supporters. One in particular said, you know what? If Trump said tomorrow, I'm running for dictator, he has my vote. I'm like, why? I mean, I liked Obama, but I would never vote for him for dictator. He had his term, he bowed out gracefully, and he's got a legacy. We fought the first Civil War, which, the American War for Independence, over not having tyrants or kings or dictators rule over us. The founding fathers wrote the Constitution. It was ratified by all the states. To try and prevent this kind of thing from happening, and some power-hungry guy who's not a good leader at all comes along, and we're going to vote for him for dictator? What? Why? I mean, to be honest with you, I'm so sick of every day. It's like having a little crybaby in the White House, always trying to draw attention to himself, like a little child. Hey, look at me, I just tweeted. So? When leadership is done right, it almost becomes seamless, and we're happy to be bored with our leaders. In many ways, that is the mark of good leadership. When our leaders are almost like they're not even there. You don't notice them. Well, that's because they're busy doing their jobs, and they're not trying to draw attention to themselves every day. But, some people think leadership means standing in the spotlight all the time. It's like, no. Trying to turn the presidency into one big reality show, and getting mad when the media didn't come running and covering it. Unfortunately, many times when leaders do get noticed, it's not for anything good, 9 times out of 10, when Obama was being noticed, it wasn't for something he was doing. It was, or for his day-to-day stuff. It was for something he was doing that was controversial or wrong. I don't know if anybody remembers the beer summit he had when he said something bad about a police officer. So he offered to have a beer with him and make up on the White House lawn, and that gesture, though I kind of think it's cool and big of him to do that, but that particular gesture was very controversial, and a lot of people didn't like it. Of course, they didn't like the comments he made either, so. Sorry, big yawn. Like I say, it's my bedtime. let's see, where I am traveling now, in the early 1800s, wasn't even a part of the United States. This was not considered part of the United States. So this was west of the original Missouri state line, went straight up, straight north from Kansas City. Kansas City didn't exist then, so it was straight north from Westport, or really straight north from the junction of the Kaw and Missouri River. And the area west of the line, I guess, was purchased. I don't know who they bought it from. The Indians, I guess. I don't know. It's called Platte Purchase, and there's a road up here called Platte Purchase Drive. Yeah, there's the sign right there, Platte Purchase Drive. It's right on, pretty much on the state line. And at one time, there was a little town up here called Barry, and it was considered to be the farthest west you could go in the United States. And this was before the war with Mexico, which brought in a lot of territory, including the west coast of the United States, south of Oregon, into the United States. Yeah, North Platte Purchase Drive. That goes on down, I think, and intersects with Barry. And there was an old military road. It was the east-west road that would take you straight to the military road. Became Barry Road, named after the town of Barry. You know, Barry, like a person's name, Barry. Yeah, go war. No, thank you. Picture Libya. It's fine if it's a distant thing and you can just like armchair quarterback it, armchair general it. Not so great when they're blowing up your house and killing your family. Dodge the sniper bullets to go get groceries. Civil wars are the worst kind of wars. Civil War III, yeah, I've been explaining, I'll say it again. Many people think that the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 was the first American Civil War, but actually the first American Civil War was the American Revolution. We were fighting essentially our own countrymen, and quite literally, especially in the south part of the United States, it really was a civil war. It really was neighbor against neighbor, because there were people who were loyal to England, called the Tories, and then you had the revolutionaries, and they would raid each other's homes, kill each other left and right. I mean, it was a really bad situation. So the first Civil War was the War of Independence. The second Civil War was the War of Southern Secession. And then the third one, which I hope doesn't come to fruition, is the war to make Donald Trump a dictator? Let's call it that. Because I had a conversation, I was talking about this earlier on this drive. I had a conversation with a pro-Trump person who said, and I quote, that if Trump ran for dictator, he would have my vote. Who's to blame? Well, I mean, it's just like any situation in family when people stop talking to each other and decide to fight rather than get along. Some people say that Donald Trump is to blame Well, he shares a good part of the blame. He's been fanning the flames, but he's not alone. And the situation with Donald Trump is more of a symptom of the division in this country rather than the actual cause. I mean, there's a lot of things. I personally blame evangelicalism, but I also blame evangelical liberals, if that's a kind of a term. People who are so set in their ideologies that they just can't let other people peacefully exist. I don't believe in, really, that there is such a thing as liberal or conservative. I mean, those are just polarity terms describing your polarity. An ideologue is an ideologue. I don't care if you are a hardcore Republican conservative or a hardcore Democrat liberal or even a socialist or whatever. It's like the same person with just different polarity. And we've got too many ideologues in this country. And also we have a disease with our media where the media just kind of like is very attracted to the fringes, you know? And of course that brings in ratings. So let's get most extreme people and interviewing them, putting them on TV and getting their point of view to the point that a lot of people become convinced, who did I vote for? I voted for no one. Actually, there's a video that I put out. You can see who we voted for. I don't know, did we describe who we voted for? And clearly, obviously, I am more in favor of the present administration than the last one. I think the last one was just nuts. All right, well, I have to end it here. I'm almost to the house, so thanks everybody for watching.